Okay, so I just got done watching an interesting, um, well-made video by I think Rob Ager at Collative Learning. If I've gotten that name wrong, I take responsibility. Um, but I have some disagreement with his. I think the tack that he takes on it, and it basically comes down to a question of what is real when it comes to human interactions. It's I've got a number of talking points here. At what point is a simulation indistinguishable from what it's simulating? And I think the broader question that um, Steven Spielberg and Stanley Kubrick's AI, artificial intelligence, what that asks is, at what point are we, you know, is the simulated basically equivalent to the real? And the question, one of the things about AI that kind of bugs me sometimes is the way in which people kind of assume that when we see AI, that it will by necessity look like human intelligence. And I'd say, no, that's not necessarily going to be the case. But of course, if we're writing fiction about it, it's a lot easier to write fiction about what we know and we know ourselves. So we look at ourselves in the mirror of these simulated human beings. It is a I've done a lot of arguing on the internet, which hopefully doesn't lower your opinion of me too much. But one insult that I've come across repeatedly is to call somebody an NPC, a non player character. And it's an interesting way of addressing people because it essentially says you're no different than some pre programmed, um, you're no different than some pre programmed character whose only job is to pipe up and say the same things over and over again when people ask them questions on a and it's got a response tree of a kind, I guess, that it can go through in order to you know answer your questions and serve its function. It's interesting how people online get turned into less than real, less than three-dimensional um, characters by the filtration effect of the uh, by all the technology, all the interfaces and all the talking points put in between each of us. I think there's a sort of a way in which all those different layers of technology and all the different dogmas that we set in between each other makes it a lot easier to look at other people as being simply elements of some other artificial system. So the question is nowadays not so much whether we can tell the difference between a real human and a machine It's whether we can tell the difference between, well, the other way around. You know, can we tell that a human being is a human being? Can we are they act? I mean, with bots on the internet, with people making responses on the internet by way of, you know, and now with the AI chatbots, you get a situation where you can't even be sure that you're talking to a human being, or you get to a situation where you're not even, where you don't feel like the other person on the other side is a human being, even if they are. So it's we need to realize that at a certain point there is an artificiality and a sort of a filtration, sort of a reductionism, a, you know, when you're basically interacting with a bunch of people via text for the most part, you know, text comments. You know, what I'm doing is relatively rare. Most people, when they respond to a video, they respond with a text comment. When you can actually have a machine artificially, you know, make a response. And so part of, I think part of what makes the question of AI and you know, AI and interactions with AI more interesting is the degree to which real human interactions have been, in a way, crippled to a point where we no longer even treat each other like we're real human beings, like we're flesh and blood, like we have emotional lives, dignity, and all these other things that need to be respected. And I'm not an angel as far as this goes. I've been, as I said, I've been in my share of internet arguments, and it's very easy to just, you know, throw elbows, you know, kick people in the nuts, so to speak, because you're not faced with an actual person. If you get somebody angry online, you get this, you know, you get this text response, which almost always the deflates the sting. I mean, it also kind of deprives you. I mean, if somebody, um, if somebody were to actually say many of the things that we say to each other online, I can't imagine. I can imagine quite a few fist fights breaking out. You know, because of, you know, people just say the most vicious things, and I'm guilty of that as well. I can be a lot more abrupt and nasty in print than I can be in person. I it There's an extra element to it when we're face to face, and I think that's part of what we need to realize is that part of what makes modern AI interaction, um, like with a chat bot, Chat GPT or whatever, um, part of what makes that workable is that you're not having to do a spontaneous deep fake of a response out of that AI. You're just getting text. So all you have to do is replicate the pattern with which somebody would respond if they were responding via text. So you just have to get the pattern of writing, get that learned, properly simulated. And make no mistake, I do not believe that there is necessarily self awareness in these modern AI systems. I don't think we have that yet, but we might at some point, and it might come quicker than we're planning. But the thing is, what AIs do good nowadays, what they do well nowadays, is pattern recognition, and not just simple on the, but more like a derivative pattern recognition, a recognition of patterns of deeper sort of relationships. That's what it seems to me that AI nowadays is good at. It can look at, you feed it a whole bunch of pictures, and it it learns what the pattern of those pictures is when it relates to a term like showing an apple. It learns what an apple looks like. It learns the texture, such that when you say "make me an apple," uh, when you say "make me an apple," it it can present you with a reasonable image of an apple that your mind then responds to and says, "Yes, that's an apple." There's an element of recognition, I think, in modern in how we judge the function of a modern AI. In other words, we teach the machine to produce recognizable images, recognizable styles of a given artist, of a given object. We kind of feed it the kind of, we tell it what we're expecting, and it's programmed well enough to where it can often deliver what we're expecting back to us, such that we go, "Good AI, good AI." You know, it's sort of like a dog bringing back a stick that we've thrown. The AI is bringing back an image that satisfies us, that, oh, this is what we're looking for. This is what, and it does so in a way that often has enough variety, enough sort of aesthetic appeal in terms of how well the colors go together, in terms of, because we are tending to. I mean, if we fed I'm wondering if we fed an AI aesthetically unappealing or aesthetically um, poor images, like one where the exposures, one's a lot of them where the exposure is off, where the colors are ugly, where things are clashing. If we did that, if we only fed it that, would we get spectacular visual results? I'd say perhaps we wouldn't. Yeah. If it's taught on, but what we do is We gather a whole bunch of professionally made aesthetically pleasing images and feed that into the AI and into the machine learning algorithm, and the machine learns that's an image. It learns a particular set of images. So why are we surprised when it's making art that looks good? Because we're feeding it art that looks good. We feed it art that looks good. It recognizes the pattern of that. It recognizes the visual pattern. It recognizes, or rather, it derives. It's an algorithm deriving a pattern. So it derives a pattern of composition. It derives a pattern of texture. It derives a pattern of, you know, colors. And it can be set to learn different styles by, we fill in what it's looking at. But what is it difficult to do with I think this is what, when the AI art. I mean, I've done quite a bit of AI art myself. I've even done experiments where I don't actually do an explicit. Uh, I'll do things like string four random words together and just enter that and see what the algorithm comes up with. I've done things where I've entered what are basically nonsense words into it and seen what does the AI come up with in response to these nonsense words. And it's fascinating what sort of images you can get out of that. That's another thing to explore. What happens when we feed it nonsense? I found that when I feed this particular favorite of mine, this Wombo Dream uh, stable diffusion AI. I found that when I feed it those sort of things, it, it it produces interesting results. And maybe it's just that it's trying to interpret the words themselves, trying to get a next best guess to what it's supposed to be picking up on. But I've seen some pretty. It's fascinating. I don't know exactly what's going on there, but at the same time, I've found it can be very difficult to get something specific. Specificity, I think, is the problem with AI. Is that you're typically going to get a version of what it trained on. So, and you're going to get it in a certain style. I found that you feed it into it that way, it's going to just spout it out. It's going to look a certain way. And I know I could, perhaps program in certain versions, program in, oh, I want this artist, I want this artist. Yeah. And about that, I think what artists ought to do is, okay, you can use my art as a basis uh, for training your AI, but you've got to pay me for the privilege. I mean, it, it's like paying for somebody copyright for somebody's work. You pay a person, okay, to teach their AI to to draw like you do, to paint like you do. That should be that would be, I think, a decent thing to do, and maybe it would mean that you'd have to find some way of doing some sort of business model that would be required so that the AI um, would be able to pay for itself. But that's just the thing. You are profiting off of somebody else's skill. But it could be, it could turn out to be, I think, an excellent income stream for artists. Get a style that is recognizable, and then okay, you can use my style, but you've got to pay for it. You can imitate me, but you've got to pay. You can teach something to imitate me, but you have to pay for the privilege. And it's sort of like the way we have a copyright for novels and movies and songs and other things that we create. We hold a temporary sort of monopoly over that, and that is what we end up. That gives us the ability to profit from our art and then do more art, which inspires other people, which inspires creativity. We're sort of devolving back into a situation, I think, um, where everybody just copies off of everybody else. Where there's no real, like in Shakespeare. Look at Shakespeare's plays. Most of Shakespeare's plays, the vast majority are based on other people's works, and you don't exactly see a whole bunch of attribution in Shakespeare's works concerning that, because that was simply the way things were done back in the day. But what I would say here is we need to make people will be a lot more on board with AI art if there is a if it profits them to do that. And that's what I'm going to say about that. But okay, going on, the question becomes, when does a simulation become indistinguishable from what it's simulating? Well, the thing about it is, as I said, there's a certain threshold of recognition. There's a certain point at which we stop saying, "Oh, that's the computer trying to look like it's drawing an apple," and we go to, "Wow, that computer has drawn an apple," or "Wow, that computer has made a that computer has succeeded in making a photorealistic apple." And this is one of the things about any sort of, I guess, illusion, any sort of creation of something uh, from, you've seen those photorealistic drawings where it just looks like somebody just practically photographed it because they've taken such pains to shade it, realistically, to put in the reflections realistically. Um, and that takes work. And there's also being able to kind of realistically simulate what it would look like if something was originally drawn that way. Sort of a reverse, taking video footage and then converting it to something that looks like it was drawn. A good example, a famous example of that, of course, is the rotoscoped animation from the "Take on Me" video by Aha. You know, the you know, famous example, but w- and done back in 1985 or so. I look at that and it's like, if I can do that, I would love to be able to do that for uh, on my own because I have some creative ideas that I could express, and that's part of the good in AI being able to do those things. Because if somebody's able to use a tool to convert imagery into animation, then a lot of people could make stuff, put stuff together that's on the cheap, and it's sort of like content making. We talk about content a lot today. But again, content swirls around this question of what looks authentic, what brings recognition not of what somebody was trying to do, but instead of what somebody succeeded in doing, or rather, a lack of recognition of the artificiality of it. So when we have a chat GPT saying, "Oh well, this is saying this and this," and it sounds the pattern of the writing sounds good, sounds like it's conveying the ideas. It's not necessarily thinking what it's writing. That's one important thing, but it can structure what it's writing so that it sounds like a decent, truthful, meaningful, meaningful. This is an important term here. Meaningful response to the prompt. In fact, maybe even good enough to where somebody can use that to communicate the point to somebody else. Again, a recognition that the output re- is equivalent. This says this pretty well, so I can use this and have be my words to I can take those words and present it to the to other people, and it's sort of, yeah, yes, there is a question of, okay, where is the room for human expression at this point? Well, I think there's plenty of room. There is just people are just going to be have to develop it's like photography did not destroy painting and drawing. People still paint and draw, but it's no longer what people do for the most part in order to communicate visual information about things like news events, or it's no longer the sole means by which we can do a portrait of somebody. We've taken something that used to take a lot of labor and hours that could only be afforded by the rich, or by those willing to put in the work to do it themselves. Like if you want to, if I mean, you would have to learn how to paint a person. You would have to learn how to do the paint, do the all the technical aspects of shading and all that other stuff. If you wanted a good portrait for you to hang in your home, it was something that you would have to do a lot of work in order to be able to do. But now we've got photographic cameras, and we can take a picture with relatively little skill, and boom, you got something that works for the purpose. You know, of course, there's also the question of, okay, am I a good photographer? you the film can somewhat make up for that. The post processing on your iPhone or your um, the post processing on your iPhone or Android phone or whatever you've got. Um, it's again, it becomes a question then of of aesthetics. Can I make a pleasing photograph here? I'm interested in, okay, if I provide it if I provide it with figures, like if I did, uh, there are several programs that allow you to sort of pose, do digital posing dolls, like you sometimes see in art stores where it's got the sort of basic looks of it. I'm wondering whether you can kind of pose those and then feed that into your AI picture generator as, okay, this is the basis of, you've got somebody who's being blown backwards. And so you pose them to where they have their arms out like that, their body sort of, tucked in. It takes it. I'm wondering if, you could get a reasonable looking illustration out of that. And it's sort of like, then it kind of makes it to where it's less a matter of simply, you know, I mean, when you have to draw or paint somebody, then the skill of making it look photorealistic is a very technical one. It's, you have to kind of figure out how to do every little detail and nuance. Whereas if you're photographing it, the computer, or not the computer, well, computer if it's a digital photograph, but if it's a good old fashioned silver and suspension on film photograph, then it's a question of, okay, what is the light coming onto it? How is, how fast of a shutter speed was I using? Uh, you're guiding a process that takes care of the little technical details of rendering the picture, takes care of that for you, but you still have to set the conditions by which the rendering takes place. So it's sort of like another stage in what photography did to drawing and what photography did to drawing and painting. And you still can do drawing and painting. That's the thing. In fact, it's got a sort of an added artistic value because it's no longer a necessary thing, because it's no longer just something that people have to do if they want to communicate visual information about, say, how a port looks or how a person looks. You can just take a photograph these days and send it on to somebody. And then there's sort of the other side of it, the Photoshop side of it, where we're taking something that was kind of bound up in a process. Like, if I take a photograph of a person, it used to be that, well, I could monkey around with it. I could do fakes, but it would be a laborious, multi it, it, it'd be a much more labor intensive, much more analog process. But with Photoshop, which I've had a good deal of experience with. You can do things that to a photograph that basically you can kind of do little small painterly things or do new compositions and other things much more easily using photographic elements as your basic parts. One of the things that it kind of gets it's getting to a point where what's being lost, I think, is the sense that in order to get an image of something, an image that is recognizable as being that thing, you no longer have to rely so much on having the real object in front of you. One of the things that made photography as convincing as it used to be was that you would need to, in order to get that image, you would have to snap the photo, or if you were doing a movie camera thing, you'd have to run a movie camera and you'd have to get that on film. And that would be laborious to try and simulate something. It's easier to lie with images, easier to lie with, make fakes of, the pornographic fakes, uh, political fakes. It's easier to lie with imagery than it used to be, and I think that's one of the things. That's one of the things that people mourn in this process is that you don't have this sort of imposition of authenticity by the medium anymore. It, it has become as malleable in its own way as the pencil now has an eraser on it. The pencil now has an eraser on it. Only this pencil does more than just shade things in. This pencil can now recreate, create. It's This is one of the problems with the age of information has had an unexpected um, blowback in that a, 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 if I put together a fake image with Trump being romanced by Putin in a rather explicit way, I'm going to leave this to your imagination, which might be enough of a sin to get me sent straight to hell. But if you wanted to do that, I think it'd be a trivial thing, even to do it realistically enough to where you'd have to take a. Is that can possibly be, you know, I think it's fully possible at this point to simulate that monstrosity of an image. Um, but the thing about that is that image, if somebody, God forbid, actually snapped a real photograph of Trump being romanced explicitly by Putin, it might be indistinguishable. The lie and the information for the lie, for the fake, the deep fake, and the information for the real one, you couldn't tell which was which at just by looking at the amount of bits for one or the other. The information, each is information. Truthful information takes up as much bandwidth as false information does. Meaningless information takes up as much bandwidth as meaningful. The quality of this is where the quality of recognition comes back into play, because that's basically talking about meaningful, true to life imagery or text or whatever done. The pattern is replicated well enough that you look at it and you say, well, that seems authentic. Authenticity is more malleable than it used to be. And that's part of the problem in dealing with AI on an emotional level. Because I really doubt that when that AI looks at that picture of a sunset that you put there, I really doubt that the machine learning that produced that actually had any feeling behind it. But that doesn't keep us from looking at that and saying, God, that's beautiful. That's gorgeous. That creates a reaction in me, but that wasn't a reaction that was built out, or rather, yes, it was built out of somebody else's um, personal reaction. In what you were feeding that AI in the in that training, the images that you train that AI with, probably contained a bunch of paintings and photographs by people who are looking at that and going, "Gee whiz, that's a wonderful sunset or sunrise or whatever. That's a great apple right there. Oh, that's gorgeous. Oh, the colors. I really wanted to look. I want the colors of that apple I'm photographing and putting through Photoshop. I want those colors, that red, that green, to pop in that apple. To pop in that thing. So if we're worried that this is built into what we're training the AI to pattern recognize. We are showing them the pattern of what we consider a aesthetically pleasing. And so that is what fuels the thing that we are recognizing. We are looking at ourselves through a mirror, a multifaceted neural net dif- stable diffusion mirror of our own aesthetic choices. The difference is this specific instance that we are generating of it. This specific instance came about simply because we told it to do this, and it looked at its past sort of its past sort of we looked at its past it looked at what it had been trained on, or it doesn't even look. The algorithm derived a pattern, an underlying sort of meta pattern out of all the images of sunsets that we took that we drew, that we created ourselves, and it derived a pattern. It derived a pattern and then fed that pattern back to us. We are being fed back our own creativity, which is a good question for what happens if we just continually and recklessly substitute AI art for real art. Because as much labor as it might be able to save, sooner or later it stagnates the art to some extent. It stagnates it into a certain style. It stagnates it into a certain, you know, a certain set of, unless you involve the artist, I think, unless you kind of keep artists in the loop, keep them, you know, being part of, how you make this photo illustration, how you make this, book cover sort of thing. I mean, I've actually used it to create two book cover images myself. And while certain elements, because I'm not terribly good at drawing. Um, as visual of a thinker as I am, I just I don't have the knack for it. It's laborious for me. So I took advantage of the AI to create a couple of cover shots for these serial things that I did online. Um, and what I did is that I took the elements that were generated, and then I wanted to do specific things, but I couldn't always get the AI to do that. So what I did is I could sort of drew those elements that it had created, and I used those elements for Photoshop compositions. So I could change where in the frame, say, a figure was. I could compose the backgrounds. I could cut out the figures and put them into different backgrounds. I could that is part of what I think people um, part of what I think if we're going to have AI as part of the whole mess here, one part that we need to acknowledge is that we're not always going to get the picture that we want out of just telling the computer to do this or do that, you know, and maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should kind of draw back and say, what I want is an element in isolation. That might be a good thing to figure out. Kind of, or maybe use Photoshop ahead of time and just kind of, okay, I'm going to want this particular element here, this particular element, rough it out, and then let the AI try and make it more organically interwoven. So like you kind of draw out the rough outline of a hill and a waterfall going down one part, and then a tree in one, and by doing that, then let it kind of create the organically synthesized and integrated image. It but I've gotten pretty far afield from the original subject, which was AI, um, artificial intelligence, 2001 Steven Spielberg movie. Um, but one of the things is what I've been kind of going on about is a sort of a simulation of a certain human behavior when we draw, when we write, text, when we do this, that, or the other. we're kind of asking the computer to simulate our artistic expression. And the thing about it is, artistic expression comes with its own sort of patterns. He made a the YouTuber I'm responding to made some good points about what is much different about what when we create characters. Those are sort of like AIs in their own way. They're sort of simulated human beings. We simulate people. We simulate character. Characters are simulated people, and we respond to these people as if they weren't the actor, but rather the character. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure that Harrison Ford isn't 100% like Indiana Jones in real life, or like John Ryan in Clear and Present Danger and Patriot Games. He's simulating those people, and he's good at simulating those people to us. But why is he able to do that? Why is Harrison Ford or Haley Joel Osment or William Hurt or hmm, or any number of the other actors that we see on screen? Why are they able to do that? Why don't we look at them and instantly go, no, that person is just pretending? How can they so convincingly portray characters, and how do we buy into that act? Well, the thing about it is, I would say, is that we highly overrate our ability to understand the world around us. We act like we should be able to know and understand other people relatively well, and we do to a certain extent, but like anybody who's ever met the real actor and been either disappointed or weirded out by the differences between that person and the person they are in real life, we we only really have so much in the way of perception of reality. Life is but a dream. Only real life is sort of like a dream where reality kind of intrudes on the dream and kind of constrains it and kind of sets, okay, here's what's actually, you're actually seeing this. This inform, I'm kind of, I might be confusing you at this point, but the neuroscience is that when people are deprived of, well, we don't need outside stimulus in order to dream something up. We generate in our own minds. We can generate in our own minds the pictures of the world around us. We can reconstruct it based on past experience. And it can seem entirely real to us while we're in the process of dreaming. And why is this possible? How can it be possible that we can create in our minds this world without uh, without actually um, without actually seeing something, without having stimulus come in from the outside to make it happen. And part of the answer is that the system is not, the system is sort of regulated and modulated and sort of guided by that, those perceptions, that in the absence of actual visual data, people are known to start hallucinating in those places where either where they've been in some sort of sensory deprivation chamber, or if they develop a blind spot on their retina, people actually can end up starting to see hallucinations or patterns in that blind spot, which are, which seem very real because the brain is kind of trying to fill in the stimulus. So it's sort of like that when when we see something, our brain is kind of getting a system that is able to kind of generate an awareness, an experience of something visual. Our retina is kind of getting, you know, attaching the engine to the rest of the train to lead that system to perceive reality rather than it just simply automatically feeding reality in and that being what works. So it's sort of like, to start with, we're kind of in a guided, we are starting out with perceptions that are pretty much derived useful lies, derived sort of patterns. We are doing that deriving ourselves, that we are now teaching AI to do, machines to do. We are already able to kind of build three-dimensional realities out of two-dimensional retinal images. We are seeing motion based not on an essential understanding of the motion out there, but based on sort of flickers of change, of movement, of retinal sensing of an edge going across our vision. We are we are our before we talk about artificial intelligence, we need to appreciate how complex actual intelligence, natural intelligence is. How how much of it is not this simple, straightforward process. Before we appreciate, try and talk about how to how to simulate, we need to recognize that we ourselves are doing many of these things mechanically ourselves, where our brains are processing, doing edge detection, doing motion detection, doing doing d- detection of differences in color, detect, dealing with like light. Uh, But the long story short is we're sort of there is a lot of what we're training the systems to do in terms of balance, for example. He talks about, the sort of the balance that we teach, modern robots to do. They had to learn that, you know, part of the way we deal with balance, we don't have a gyroscope. We we have a sort of we have semicircular canals, but we also have proprioception. We have systems that tell us, okay, where is my finger in space? Where is my arm in space? You know, what am I doing here? What kind of what kind of resistance am I feeling here? You know, our brain's doing a whole lot of processing of the sensory data, and it's kind of creating a sort of an emergent pattern within us that guides our actions, that guides, you know, these things that we take for granted. And one of those things is balance. It is exceedingly difficult to balance on two legs. It's a very dynamic thing. We have a whole lot of, you know, springs and tension structures in our body, muscles that are basically devoted to keeping us standing upright, and muscles that are, you know, that counter those muscles in order to make sure that everything is kind of, you know, in proper tension, rather than just being, you know, I've got, you know, a joint that goes like part a great part of it is that we actually have sort of natural hinges and shock absorbers and all kinds of other things that are basically there in order to allow us to do this complex act of standing up and keeping stood up. So, but what happens if you get if I program and machine a robot such that it can stand up on two legs and walk like we do, am I simulating any longer the act of walking, or have I actually given that machine the capability to walk? If I teach a if I teach a if I teach a computer to draw and it draws, is it actually simulating the ability to draw, or is it actually creating an actual limited case of what's of that sort of drawing? If I give the machine emotional responses, at what point is am I actually, in order to get it to the point where it can actually respond to us in an emotional way, at what point am I actually at what point are the emotions real for all intents and purposes? What distinguishes a fake emotion from a real one? You know, it's just a response. Is it just a, you know, program routine? Yes, it might there might be an element of that, but there's an element of that in us too. You know, and when he cites that looking at the flesh fair, a part of the AI movie where Haley Joel Osment's character and his Jude Law's Gigolo Joe, that's the name of the character, uh, where they get captured by these anti-robot fanatics and they you know and they're taken to this sort of coliseum sort of thing where all the people are basically ripping these robots up, blowing them out of cannons, uh, melting them with acid and such. And there's a part where basically the character is Haley Joel Osment's David, who's a very human-like robot who is programmed to feel to act to act like a child and feel like a child. He reacts with apparent real fear to being to having acid poured on him, and he begins to get the sympathy of folks in the audience. Now, the the guy at collative learning, he kind of says, "Oh, but he's faking it. The guy's telling the truth. He is faking it." I would ask, is he? At a certain point, I mean, I think there's another incident earlier on, and it's part of what accident, ultimately gets the child robot David exiled from his happy home is that he almost drowns his real boy brother. He almost drowns him because somebody pokes him with a knife, and that inspires a reaction in him. But you could do the same thing to an actual human being, and they'll do it. They'll react, with pain, fear, and that sort of thing. Is it because they're machines? I mean, it's basic programming. You can even get the most brainless of insects and crustaceans and mollusks to draw from pain. You don't need to be conscious to withdraw from pain. That is, or to withdraw from injury or the possibility of injury. This is something that living beings do, and this is something we'd probably want. Um, if we paid good money to make sophisticated robots, wouldn't we want those robots to have a sense of self-preservation? In fact, it's one of Asimov's three laws. A robot must protect its own existence. You know, the other two being that you know, let's see, Let me bring up Asimov's three laws. Asimov's three laws of robotics: a robot shall not harm a human, or by inaction allow a human to come to harm. The robot will obey any instruction given to it by a human. And the third law is the robot shall avoid actions or situations that could cause it to come to harm itself. So we want our robots to. That's Isaac Asimov basically putting. Okay, your robot's going to be designed so that it doesn't. It does its best to avoid harm unless it would mean disobeying a human's order or uh, or allowing a human to come to harm or harming a human, so on and so forth. Um, and why would we do that? Because robots are sophisticated machines, are expensive machines, but also to a certain extent, it's like Um, it's a survival instinct. We want things to a certain level of sophistication. We want things to protect their own existence, even if even if we've made them sophisticated enough to feel like they might want to end that existence. That's one thing to consider. But the question becomes: we're programming these robots with all kinds of different um, sort of less intelligent. I mean, um, I've learned, what I've learned about artificial intelligence in part from a book by, well, now somewhat disgraced man named Marvin Minsky. Um, but his disgrace didn't have anything to do with his artificial intelligence, um, his work in that field. But a he has this magnificent book called The Society of Mind. And his idea was basically that instead of artificial intelligence being some sort of magical little figure inside the robot's head, that instead what we would have with artificial intelligence was smaller, dumber parts that would then work together in order to create a more intelligent uh, collection of agents, of programmed agents. So, in essence, instead of trying to program everything into one masterful sort of, you know, instead of attempting the sort of the poof, ex nihilo sort of creation of, you know, the sort of Michelangelo, God reaching out to touch the fingertips of man. Instead of trying something like that, or instead, like if you want something that picks up a pin, for example, you would have one part of the program that would be about acquiring, I guess, the where it is in this, if I'm rotating the arm in this direction, okay, I have one part that tells me how to do that. Then there's the one like this. Then there's the part, the each little finger would have its own little program, its own little sort of system to tell it how to properly grasp and carry the pen over to where it needs to be. So you have smaller, simpler, more stupid agents doing work that adds up to something more intelligent when you put it all together. So why is that of interest to you? Well, we're looking at um, rather than try and kind of distill the essence of a particular thing in and of itself, we're actually looking to break down the task that the robot is meant to do. We're looking to break it down into simpler jobs that, as the different parts take care of it. Like if I'm standing up, for example, there's a part of my programming, my neurological programming, that is built around keeping my core muscles, my abdominal muscles, my back muscles in the proper tension to where that I don't fall over or fall back, you know, to where I'm balanced in equilibrium. There's also parts that are dealing with my, knees and my ankles that are dealing with, you know, the way my feet are pressed against the ground. And so you have different parts of my neurology paying attention to things. I mean, the famous patellar response, when you get that tap on the knee and you kick. What is that all about? Well, that's part of your leg maintaining, it's looking at the tightening of that tendon, of that ligament that between your lower leg bones and your knee bone in the your thigh. It's looking for a sudden tension on that particular part so that it counteracts it by tightening that particular joint. So it tightens that particular joint. That's part of what keeps you from falling backwards. And it's a reflex. So you don't even have to pay attention to it. It's just doing that on its own. And there are a number of reflexes and other processes at work. And those help are part of what allows you to stand up straight, and part of what makes it so difficult to actually simulate or rather emulate and successfully replicate the process of learning to stand. So the question is, if you get enough of these things together, if you get it doing enough of this stuff together, aren't we going to get behaviors out of this that look that not only look like, I mean, if we program a bunch of little robots to swarm in a certain way, do we not at a certain point actually just create a swarm? Is it just no different? I mean, it's why it's been easy to simulate birds flocking for the longest time in computer animation, because you could, just applying a few rules together creates the behavior. You just you keep your partner, you follow the general direction of the pack. You follow your partner, you keep a certain distance away, and so on and so forth. We can pretty much model these behaviors with just a few rules. Now, those few rules emerge a complex behavior. And this kind of throws us off sometimes because we like to think, oh, we're all smart and we do everything by, you know, we do everything by, our ingenious intelligence. But no, a lot of it is just figuring out the rules and operating by those rules. And I think you already, if you got, say, robots to a point where one, they're functioning as, lovers, two, You've got them functioning as nannies, taking care of children. Three, you have a character acting like a surrogate child. You're already at a point where you are putting together programming some pretty complex behavior. You know, you you are simulating some pretty complex, and even if it falls short of the of even if it falls short of the uncanny valley, which a lot of it does in this movie, then it after a certain point, it's what's the difference? Now with now we can tell that part of the reaction isn't genuine, and part of it's we recognize that the machines are just carrying out these programs, that they're not necessarily doing these things out of more complex learned behaviors. It's just basically frozen human judgment. But you kind of see hints throughout the movie that the characters are acting in ways that are not that are not they're acting in ways that are not necessarily um, pre-planned, that are not necessarily just there's some spontaneity developing. I mean that the main character's obsession of getting back to the love of his mother, getting back to her good graces by becoming a real boy. The character, it may be an example of a programming loop run amok, but it's kind of but it's also I'd say there's a lot of from that programming loop. There's a lot of complex behavior manifesting. The character is formulating plans. The character is setting goals. Nobody told it. Nobody told it to go looking for the blue fairy. No, no. Um, it decided, okay, I'm going to do that. It reasoned itself the way a child might reason. Um, you know, oh, if I do this, if I fulfill this function, if I follow this fairy tale, I will. This will happen. Nobody programmed it to want to recapitulate Pinocchio. It look it she read it that story. She read him that story, and that that prompted him to go, okay, if my mother won't accept me as I am, then I will find a way to change myself. Here we find the here we find the presence of a strange loop. The 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 robot is reprogramming itself, setting its own goals in pursuit of a higher goal. It's remaking itself from the bottom up. And I think that's part of what what the person doing the video kind of missed. I mean, we see Gigolo Joe go from just being a sex robot to being a surrogate father. Nobody programmed him to be a surrogate father, but he somehow he adapts, he evolves into that role. And the other character, you know, I think I think he's also wrong in terms of the final scenes of the movie where the future robots show up. I don't think that's an unreal situation. I think that's actually um, what happened. But I don't think it's entirely face value. I'll explain later, but the thing about it is these characters are showing intelligence in ways that, creative problem solving, even if it's wrong-headed, and the fact that it could be wrong-headed, that that these robots aren't simply creating human responses out of nothing. I think looking at the behavior, it's AI has its limits, and part of those limits are the fact that we're trying to create it out of just sheer programming. But when an intelligence starts to one of the things about human beings, it's not necessarily any one quality. The ability to communicate, the ability to make tools, the ability to do this. It is our ability overall to rewrite ourselves, to rewrite our understanding, to upgrade our programming. Well, what we are looking at here with with these robots is that evolving they're evolving behaviors in response to their situations that are creative. They're doing something they weren't necessarily programmed to do, adapting their old routines, their old abilities to solve the new problems. So it's and I think when we see the reaction of the crowd, I don't think they're being fooled so much as, or rather, if they're being fooled, they're being fooled in a way. I mean, because you look at a lot of the robots that they're torturing and destroying, and they're you know somewhat human, but they've got significant differences from human beings. They've got a look that's you know that tells you they're a machine. But now you have this human looking robot, this android who is for all you know who looks pretty much like a human boy. And suddenly the question becomes, what is our response? And we have a response of recognition. People look at it and they can't believe that that's a boy? That's a robot? No, that looks too much like a boy. There's a point at which if we simulate humanity enough in a robot, that I mean, we already do to a certain extent. We talk to our phones these days. We talk to our phones and our phones reply back. I mean, you want an example? I don't know whether the microphone will pick this up, but hey Google, tell me a joke.
What's a pig's favorite karate move? A pork chop.
I'm sorry I asked, but still, I just asked a computer to tell me a joke, and it told me a joke. An awful joke, but it still understood what I asked enough to respond like that. Now that may be preset sort of circumstances, but still, the processing to get you to the point where it understands these words together in context. You are getting to a point where it can reproduce certain human functions. For example, it's you know, hey Google, please turn off the light at in 5 minutes.
Got it. I'll
Remember,
turn off the bedside lamp at 2:47 p.m.
so I just told it to do that. Hey Google, please turn on the light in 7 minutes.
Got it. I'll turn on the bedside lamp at 2:49 p.m.
Okay, so we're gonna see the lights go on and off in a few minutes. Just remember I said that. But it's arranging and scheduling the behavior of that light behind me. So you're going to see in a few minutes, because I'm going to probably yak on for that much longer, you will see the light go on and go off without me getting up from my chair to do anything. I can set alarms by voice. I can, ask it to play music, although of a limited variety from limited outlets. We are, and part of this requires, as the Siri and other digital assistants, it requires a connection back because it's having to semantically interpret what we're saying in order to derive the proper response. So when we do that, we're give you know this is going to build. There's going to be a point at which we have to reckon with AIs as behaving as creatures with behavior rather than simply as machines of some degree of autonomy. I think it's a certain point, we're going to have to reckon with the way, for example, a self-driving car. That's a thing. We're going to have to deal with the way a self-driving car behaves, what its idiosyncrasies are going to be. We're going to have to deal with the behavior of machines. And that behavior is going to become more complex and sophisticated. It's going to become, we already, to a certain extent, adapt to the quirks and behaviors of our machines, even though they're not necessarily always that intelligent. You know, I just had the reason why I'm home making this video at the moment is that I had to deal with an air conditioning problem, you know. And of course, the air conditioning unit has certain behaviors, but and we learn to deal with those behaviors. I have a car. The next item on my agenda of what to do is I have to get a new battery for my car. Um, Hopefully, just the front end battery, which is the classic car battery. As a hybrid, it's got a back battery that's you know going to have to be dealt with at some point or another. But there was a point where I was able to get this start, but I had to play with it a little bit. So machines, by virtue simply of the fact that they're complicated, often have idiosyncratic behavior. Behavior that is, sort of, that comes from the simple fact that we're no longer simply just doing a lever or a simple pulley or these other things. The machines develop quirks simply from the fact that they are complex machines that, because of their because of all the parts that go into them, um, have behaviors that aren't just simple. There is emergent behavior from it, and we see the same from computers. Programming nowadays can cause just mystifying faults to occur, and what prompts this? Well, it's simply the fact that we've programmed things with you know hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions lines of code. So there are so many moving parts going back and forth. And what chaos theory will tell you is that if you get enough moving parts into a system, even just a few moving parts, you can make it behave in unexpected and emergent ways. And I think that's an insight that we need to bring into the discussion of AI in the movie artificial intelligence, because we do see them learning complex self-initiated behaviors. Gigolo Joe isn't programmed to be a nanny, isn't programmed to take care of a child, but by the end of the show, he is offering he is offering to be essentially uh, the child's father, this child robot's father. And the teddy bear is acting in very sophisticated ways and behaving with a great deal of probably unprogrammed. There we go. And that's probably going to be the next step in these things, because at some point we're going to give these things enough sophistication that they're going to be taking things on their own initiative. I mean, that's at a certain point, we're going to teach these things how to be creative. Of course, teaching something how to be creative and you know it being creative in a way that you understand, that's going to be two different things. Um, we're absorbed in so many philosophical questions about machines that come from our philosophical questions about dealing with slavery and all these other things, where we're just asking, okay, what happens when you know, when we rely on these artificial intelligences in order to do work? Are we going to get to a point where they decide to turn on us because we're treating them like slaves? Well, I think Douglas Adams had an interesting answer to that question. If you notice in the in that there were these systems, particularly that were designed to take great pleasure at opening and closing, dispensing a drink for you, and you know taking your trash or whatever. That we might end up just programming things to like the fact that they're doing work for us. Yeah, but I think what we're seeing in terms, I think even before they make the David robot, the the even before we have a robot that has emotional responses of its own, sadness, jealousy, anger, uh, bewilderment, so on and so forth. Um, I think we're going to see, I think we're already seeing sort of behavioral complexities, which, I'm going to bring it back to the end so that I can bring this to an end. Um, I don't think the ending is a dream. I think the AIs really do come back to Earth and really do look at the ice locked city and find poor Haley Joel Osment's character, all tuckered out from years of wishing for, uh, years of wishing for the uh, blue fairy to make him a real boy. I don't take it um, at face value that what we see with the mother and everything, that what we see there is real. I don't think she is real. I think she is a simulation. Um, and I think she's a simulation designed to end David's torment and allow him to finally rest, having fulfilled his function. It's basically the the AIs are seeing a primitive version of themselves. They're seeing, oh, look at this, oh, this poor thing. he was built to do this function, and then his owner abandoned him, and you know he went through all this trouble trying to experience her love, and feel that, and it's the robots are being compassionate, you know and before he can recognize, because he's an intelligent robot, before he can recognize that she is merely a simulation, that he himself is in a simulation. He's given that one day, he's given that one period of time where he gets her unalloyed love, and then they allow him to shut down in peace, which makes it kind of a sad ending, despite how syrupy and sentimental it might seem at first blush. Um, this is sort of a. I mean, if you see once you realize that the kid is just programming, once you realize that, then it makes perfect sense. Even the arbitrary, irrational sort of requirement that, we can only bring them back for one day. They're lying to him. They're they're deceiving him, but they're doing it for compassionate reasons. And it's that emotional ability. The I think one of the fundamental things when we finally get true AI there, and not just fancy machine learning, emotions are going to be important, because what intelligent human beings do is often ruled by heuristics, sort of good enough, sort of cognitive strategies that we use to kind of quickly figure out what we should be doing and how we're going to do it. I think, and we also have a sort of an overall sense of things. Like we find certain locations to be, rather than try and analyze every little fact in our surroundings to figure out, oh, is this place dangerous? Well, what does our brain do? It takes a general subconscious sort of look at the world around us and says, okay, things are not quite right. There's something up about this location. It's too dark. There's too many pointy things. You know, it's too quiet, so on and so forth. We kind of get into this thing of robots being smarter than us because they can compute things more quickly, but that's just algorithmic efficiency. That's just, oh, I can execute this process ultra fast. The real thing is going to be being able to understand things for real at a fast pace. We talk about what is real and what is fake, and he talks about it. He talks about the emotions. I would argue that David's emotions come across as real because they are. He is designed. to have these strong motivations. They are, if they're to a point where they can program somebody or something to be able to act like the best human lover, well, if you can program somebody to be a seductive lover, then even if they don't actually feel anything for the woman, well, then you can program more sophisticated sort of motivations into things. You just have to get to a different level of sophistication. You've already gotten to the level where, a person can, you know, negotiate and deal with a human being in terms of a sexual encounter, in terms of, asking a question or whatever. It's just, just that much more sophisticated, putting that much more programming complexity into it. And at that point, the question is it real or not? Well, kids certainly seemed attached, and the kids certainly seemed to be, you know, scared of being destroyed, scared of the other beings, other robots being torn apart. You can say it's just a routine, but when you're getting to the sophistication level where you can actually do many of these things, it's like, at what point is the distinction immaterial? And it's sort of like, it's probably at the point where it's sort of like, it's the question of imitation versus emulation. Like if I'm singing a song that I heard. Imitation is me just trying to, fake it. Um, Emulation would be more like me being a having a good ear or perfect pitch or whatever, and being able to catch. Okay, this is the note. This is the chord. Okay, da 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 da. But a much better, more organically created sort of response. Uh, and what we would want, if we were building a David, if we were building a machine like that, we would be we would be building something that would show attachment, that would show affection. How do you how would you actually program for that? That's a good question, I would say. Um, and the answer is you really couldn't. So what do you have to do instead? Well, before you ever had a David, you would probably have to have any number of prototypes that come before David who have more limited sort of um, who have more limited sort of emotional responses. But you'd want a certain level of sophistication of level of behavior, and you'd have to really kind of figure out a more generalized set of rules that then would tend to come together emergently to create the emotional response. It, it wouldn't just be da 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 da. Okay, da 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 da. In fact, to even get to that point, I think they would have to have a language that was approaching artificial intelligence, that was approaching what we would consider. It wouldn't just be. I mean, you'd have sort of programming loops, but they would be of an entirely different variety than the kind that we would. It'd be a whole another level of sophistication compared to what we do with a computer like the ones we're accessing via Siri or Google. So, the question then becomes, if I put a knife to the arm of a robot and it causes them to shrink back or to grab somebody to put in front of them or whatever. There's a certain point at which you're the question is, okay, am I merely going to a subroutine, or am I triggering something that's effectively an analog of my response? If somebody started poking my forearm with a knife and perhaps drawing blood, is it fake, or is the machine operating in actual self-defense? I mean, we have to figure out nowadays whether a self-driving car, who's responsible if the self-driving car accidentally runs somebody over. At some point, the question of whether it's real or not, it's that's the real question. That becomes an irrelevant question because the behavior itself is real. The question would be, okay, would this character would this machine then be able to recognize, for example, if the behavior is excessive, to learn some sort of sense of what they're doing, some self awareness. It's I think the topic of artificial intelligence is a lot deeper, especially in this movie, than people might give it credit for. It's a flat term with much more complicated um, implications to it. So I'm going to leave it at that, and y'all have a good afternoon. Goodbye.